A lonely 65-year-old veteran takes a bullet, saving a biker's daughter from armed criminals. What the Hells Angels do next will change an entire town's understanding of honor, loyalty, and brotherhood. Before we begin, whether you're having your breakfast or relaxing for the evening, you're exactly where you need to be. Love doesn't hide behind appearances. My dream is to reach 1,000 subscribers. So leave your like and subscribe. This helps us bring more stories like this to you. Frank Miller sat in his usual booth at Maggie's diner, nursing his third cup of coffee and watching the morning rush of Clearwater, Montana through rain-streaked windows. At 65, Frank had perfected the art of being invisible. Another aging veteran in flannel and work boots, forgotten by a world that had moved on from the wars he'd fought and the friends he'd buried. Every morning for 5 years, Frank had claimed the same corner booth, ordered the same breakfast he could barely afford, and observed the small dramas of small-town life unfold beyond the glass. The routine gave structure to days that otherwise held no purpose beyond surviving until the next one. At precisely 7:23 a.m., the diner's door chimed as it always did, announcing the arrival of Frank's favorite part of each morning. 6-year-old Sophie Chen burst through the entrance like concentrated sunshine, her backpack bouncing as she scanned the restaurant with bright brown eyes that missed nothing. "Daddy!" Sophie squealed, launching herself toward a corner table where James Razor Wilson sat reading the newspaper. Razor's massive frame, covered in leather and decorated with the Hells Angels colors, should have been intimidating. Instead, he transformed into something entirely different when his daughter's small arms wrapped around his neck. "Morning, Princess," Razor said, his gravelly voice softening to barely above a whisper as he lifted Sophie onto his lap. "How's my best girl today?" "Good. I learned a new song at school yesterday. Want to hear it?" Frank smiled despite himself, watching the tender scene unfold as it had every morning for months. The contrast never failed to amaze him, this gentle giant covered in tattoos and patches, completely undone by a 6-year-old's enthusiasm. "Frank, you want more coffee?" Maggie approached with the pot, following his gaze toward the father and daughter. Sweet kid, that one. Hard to believe all the nasty things people say about her daddy. No. Frank had heard the whispers, the concerned murmurs about having motorcycle gang members frequenting a family establishment. He'd also seen Razor carefully help elderly customers to their cars, leave generous tips despite obviously modest means, and patiently answer Sophie's endless questions about everything from motorcycles to mathematics. "People see what they expect to see," Frank replied quietly. "Most don't look past the leather." Sophie's laughter echoed across the diner as Razor made exaggerated faces during her song performance. Other customers glanced over, with expressions ranging from amused tolerance to barely concealed disapproval, but Frank felt only warmth watching the obvious devotion between father and daughter. "Daddy, can we go see Grandma after school?" Sophie asked, having finished her musical presentation. "Course we can, Princess. Uncle Tank's picking you up today, remember? I got club business this afternoon." Frank had met Tank Williams once, another Angels member whose intimidating appearance masked unexpected gentleness. The man had helped Frank carry groceries to his truck during a particularly painful day when arthritis made lifting impossible. "Will you be careful, Daddy?" Sophie's voice carried the worry of a child who'd learned too young that the world could be dangerous. "Always am, Princess. Your old man's too stubborn to let anything happen to him." The morning routine continued as always. Razor walked Sophie to the school bus stop, visible through the diner's front window, waited until the bus disappeared around the corner, then returned to finish his coffee before heading to whatever club business occupied his day. Frank had been watching this ritual for months, noting the subtle changes in Razor's demeanor once Sophie was safely away. The gentle father disappeared, replaced by someone harder, more alert. A man who understood that his world contained dangers his daughter should never see. Today felt different, though Frank couldn't identify why. Razor seemed more tense, checking his phone repeatedly and glancing toward the parking lot where his Harley sat gleaming in the morning sun. "You okay, son?" Frank found himself asking as Razor prepared to leave. Razor looked surprised that the quiet veteran had spoken. In months of sharing the same space, they'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words beyond basic pleasantries. "Yeah, just got some things to handle today. Nothing Sophie needs to worry about." Frank nodded, understanding. He'd spent enough years in situations where loved ones were better off not knowing the details. "She's a good kid. You've done right by her." Something shifted in Razor's expression, surprise giving way to gratitude. "Thanks, Frank. Means more than you know, coming from someone like you." "Someone like me?" "Someone who served, someone who understands what it means to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves." Before Frank could respond, Razor was gone, the diner door chiming his departure. Frank returned to his coffee and his observations, unaware that he'd just had the most important conversation of his life. 3 hours later, Frank was still in his booth, making his single cup of coffee last as long as possible, when the first sign of trouble appeared. A black sedan with tinted windows pulled into the parking lot, moving too slowly, stopping too precisely in a position that blocked the most obvious exit routes. Frank's military instincts, dormant for decades, suddenly blazed to life. He recognized tactical positioning when he saw it, recognized the patience of predators waiting for prey. His eyes found Razor's Harley, still parked near the diner's entrance, and understanding hit him like cold water. The sedan's doors opened, revealing 3 men in expensive suits who moved with the fluid coordination of professionals. Frank couldn't hear their conversation, but he could read their body language, could see the bulges under their jackets that indicated concealed weapons. Inside the diner, Razor sat oblivious, focused on paperwork spread across his table. He was positioned with his back to the windows, a mistake that would have gotten him killed in Frank's war, and might get him killed in whatever war had followed him home. Frank's hands began to shake, but not from age or arthritis. Adrenaline flooded his system as combat reflexes he'd thought were buried forever clawed their way back to the surface. He recognized the setup, understood what was about to happen, and realized that in approximately 30 seconds, violence would erupt in the one place where Sophie Chen felt safe and happy. The 3 men moved toward the diner's entrance with purposeful strides. Frank caught a glimpse of the lead man's face, cold eyes, professional calm, the expression of someone who killed for money rather than passion. Time slowed, as it always had before combat. Frank saw Razor finally notice the approaching threat, saw him reach for something under his jacket, saw the realization dawn that he was trapped in a confined space with innocent civilians in the crossfire. The diner door chimed as Death walked in, wearing expensive suits. "James Wilson," the lead gunman announced, as the 3 men fanned out across the diner's entrance, their movements precise and coordinated. "You've been avoiding some important conversations." Razor slowly stood from his booth, hands visible, calculating angles and distances with the same tactical awareness Frank recognized from his own combat experience. "Marco, thought you boys might show up eventually." Frank remained motionless in his corner booth, but his mind raced through possibilities and probabilities. 5 civilians in the diner, including Maggie, 3 armed professionals blocking the exit, 1 Hell's Angel with whatever weapon he kept concealed. Mathematics that added up to bloodshed no matter how the situation played out. "Your club owes money," Marco continued, his voice carrying the casual menace of a man comfortable with violence. "Our boss is tired of waiting for payments that never come." "Take it up with Steele," Razor replied, referring to his club president. "I just follow orders." "See, that's the problem. Steele's been real hard to find lately. But you got predictable habits. Same diner every morning, same routine, same—" Marco's smile turned predatory. "Same little girl who rides the school bus every day." Frank felt ice form in his stomach. The threat had just expanded beyond a simple debt collection to something infinitely more dangerous. "Sophie's got nothing to do with club business." Razor's voice carried deadly warning despite his vulnerable position. Maybe not. But she makes excellent motivation for cooperation. The mathematics changed. Frank understood that these men hadn't come just for money or intimidation. They'd come to take Razor's daughter as leverage against the Hells Angels. In Frank's experience, children used as bargaining chips rarely survived the negotiations. Maggie had frozen behind the counter, her face pale with terror as she realized her diner had become a battlefield. Two elderly customers huddled in their booth, too frightened to move. A young mother with a toddler pressed against the far wall, trying to shield her child with her body. "Here's how this works," Marco continued. "You come with us quietly. Help us have a conversation with your president about outstanding debts. Maybe arrange a meeting with Steele where we can discuss payment schedules. Cooperative behavior means your daughter stays safe." "And if I don't cooperate?" Marco's smile widened. "Well, accidents happen to little girls all the time. School buses crash, children wander into traffic, playground equipment fails." Frank had heard enough. 65 years old, arthritis in his joints, no backup, no weapons except the folding knife in his pocket and reflexes that belonged to a different war. But some lines couldn't be crossed, some threats couldn't be tolerated, some innocence had to be protected, regardless of personal cost. The diner door chimed again. Sophie Chen burst through the entrance like she did every morning, her backpack bouncing as she scanned the restaurant. But instead of 7:23 a.m., it was 10:47 a.m., and instead of rushing toward her father's loving arms, she walked into a hostage situation that would define the rest of Frank's life. "Daddy!" Sophie called out, then stopped as she noticed the strange men and the tension that filled the air like smoke. "Sophie, no!" Razor breathed, his face going white as his worst nightmare materialized. "Baby, you need to leave. Right now." But Marco had already moved, positioning himself between Sophie and the exit. "Actually, this works out perfectly. Now we can have our conversation right here." Sophie looked between her father and the strangers, her 6-year-old mind struggling to process the danger she'd walked into. "Daddy, what's happening?" "Nothing, Princess. Just some men who got confused about where they're supposed to be." Marco reached into his jacket and withdrew a chrome-plated pistol that gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights. "Sophie, right? Pretty name for a pretty girl. Why don't you come stand next to Uncle Marco while your daddy and I have our talk?" "Don't touch her," Razor snarled. But Marco's companions had their own weapons drawn now, creating a crossfire that would turn the diner into a slaughter if anyone moved wrong. Sophie took a step backward, instinctively seeking safety, but Marco tracked her movement with his pistol. "Now, Sophie, don't be shy. We're all going to be friends." Frank watched as the gunman's finger moved to the trigger, saw the calculation in Marco's eyes that said he was willing to hurt a child to control her father, understood that whatever happened next would leave Sophie Chen either traumatized or dead. Time stopped. Training kicked in. 65 years old, but still a soldier when children needed protecting, Frank exploded from his booth with speed that belonged to a younger man, covering the 15 feet to Sophie's position in 3 strides. He wrapped his arms around the 6-year-old girl just as Marco's pistol tracked toward her, just as the finger tightened on the trigger, just as the mathematics of violence demanded payment in innocent blood. The gunshot echoed through the diner like thunder. Frank felt the bullet tear through his chest, felt his legs give out as he and Sophie crashed to the floor in a tangle of arms and terror. Warm blood spread across his flannel shirt as his vision grayed around the edges. But Sophie was unhurt. Sophie was alive. Sophie was crying but breathing, and that was all that mattered as Frank's world narrowed to a single point of light surrounded by spreading darkness. "You stupid old man!" Marco snarled, standing over Frank's bleeding form. "All you've done is make this harder on everyone." And Razor's roar of rage filled the diner as he launched himself across the room, but Marco's companions were ready for him. The confrontation erupted into chaos as tables overturned and more gunshots cracked through the air. Frank held Sophie against his chest, using his body to shield her from the violence raging around them. His breath came in short gasps as blood pooled beneath them, but he managed to whisper the words that might keep her alive. "Play dead, sweetheart. Close your eyes and don't move until your daddy tells you it's safe." Sophie's small body went limp against his chest, trusting him completely, as sirens wailed in the distance, and Frank Miller gave everything he had to protect a child who called someone else daddy. The emergency room at Clearwater General Hospital had seen its share of trauma, but the events of that morning challenged every staff member's ability to process human cruelty alongside human courage. Frank Miller lay unconscious in Trauma Bay 3, machines monitoring the vital signs that grew weaker with each passing hour, despite 2 emergency surgeries and 4 units of transfused blood. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Sophie despite the shared surname, interviewed witnesses while doctors worked frantically to save the man who'd thrown himself into gunfire to protect a child he barely knew. The story that emerged challenged every assumption about the morning's violence. "The old guy was sitting in his usual spot," Maggie testified, her hands still shaking hours after watching her diner become a battlefield. "Those men in suits were professional killers, Detective. They weren't there for robbery or anything random. They came specifically for Razor." And Frank Miller intervened, didn't hesitate. The minute that monster pointed his gun at little Sophie, Frank moved like he was 20 years younger, took the bullet meant for her, and probably saved that baby's life. By afternoon, word had spread through Clearwater's tight-knit community with the speed of wildfire. The narrative that emerged wasn't the one most people expected. Instead of another story about motorcycle gang violence endangering innocent civilians, the truth revealed an aging veteran sacrificing himself to protect a child from professional criminals who'd targeted her father. James Razor Wilson sat in the hospital corridor, his leather jacket torn and bloodied from his own fight with Marco's men. He'd managed to disarm one of the gunmen before police arrived, but not before taking a bullet to his shoulder and watching a stranger nearly die protecting his daughter. "Daddy?" Sophie approached carefully, her small hand reaching for his uninjured arm. "Is Mr. Frank going to be okay?" Razor gathered his daughter close, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. "I don't know, Princess. The doctors are doing everything they can." "He saved me, didn't he? Like a superhero." "Yeah, baby, he saved you, just like a superhero." Sophie considered this seriously. But superheroes don't usually get hurt so bad when they save people. "Real superheroes do, Princess. That's what makes them real." The hospital's main entrance rumbled with the sound of approaching motorcycles at 4:17 p.m. Steele Rodriguez, president of the Clearwater Hells Angels, led a convoy of 30 bikes through the hospital parking lot. Word had spread through the motorcycle community faster than police reports, carrying a story that demanded response. Steele found Razor in the surgical waiting area, still holding Sophie while she colored pictures to leave for Frank when he woke up. The club president's weathered face showed the strain of the day's events. "How bad?" Steele asked quietly. "Touch and go. Bullet nicked an artery, collapsed one lung. He's been in surgery for 6 hours. Steele studied Sophie, who continued coloring with intense concentration. "She okay?" "Physically, yeah. Emotionally." Razor's voice trailed off as he watched his daughter carefully select each crayon. "She keeps asking why a stranger would get hurt protecting her." "Good question. What'd you tell her?" "That some people are just built different, built to protect others even when it costs them everything." Steele nodded slowly. Frank Miller served 3 tours in Vietnam, earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. Lost his wife to cancer 8 years ago, no kids of his own. Lives alone in a trailer on Elm Street, survives on disability and Social Security. "How'd you find all that out so fast?" "Tank's got connections at the VA. Figured we needed to know who we're dealing with." Steele's voice carried the weight of decision. "Church meeting tonight. Full patch holders only. We need to discuss how the club responds to this." Razor looked down at Sophie, who'd finished her picture of flowers and rainbows meant to cheer up Mr. Frank. "What's to discuss? Man took a bullet for my daughter. Far as I'm concerned, he's family now." "Agreed. Question is how we show the community that attacking one of our families, blood or chosen, has consequences. Before Razor could respond, Dr. Martinez emerged from the surgical suite, his scrubs still stained with Frank's blood. His expression was carefully neutral as he approached the small group. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Dr. Martinez, Frank Miller's surgeon. Are you family?" "Close enough," Steele answered before Razor could speak. "What's his condition?" "He's stable for now. We managed to repair the arterial damage and reinflate his lung, but he's lost a significant amount of blood. The next 24 hours are critical." Sophie looked up from her coloring. "Can I see him?" Dr. Martinez studied the 6-year-old girl whose life Frank had saved. "He's sedated and on a ventilator, sweetheart. It might be scary for you to see him like that." "I want to tell him thank you," Sophie insisted with the stubborn determination of someone far older than her years. "Maybe tomorrow when he's more stable," the doctor suggested gently. As Dr. Martinez departed, Steele made a decision that would define his club's response to the day's events. "Razor, take Sophie home. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start showing this town what Brotherhood really means. What are you planning?" Steele's smile held no warmth for enemies, but infinite protection for family. "We're going to make sure Frank Miller understands that saving one of our children makes him one of our brothers. And we're going to make sure everyone else understands that attacking our brothers has consequences they can't imagine." Outside, 30 motorcycles prepared to carry word throughout the state that the Hells Angels had a debt of honor to repay, not with violence, but with the kind of loyalty that transformed communities and challenged every assumption about what Brotherhood really meant. The war was far from over, but Frank Miller would not face recovery alone. Frank Miller's eyes opened to a world of white walls, beeping machines, and the overwhelming scent of antiseptic that triggered memories of field hospitals in Vietnam. His chest felt like it was wrapped in fire, and breathing required conscious effort that left him exhausted after just a few minutes of consciousness. "Mr. Frank," a small voice drew his attention to the bedside chair where Sophie Chen sat, coloring another picture. "You're awake!" Frank tried to speak, but found his throat raw from the ventilator. Sophie noticed his struggle and carefully poured water from a pitcher into a cup with a straw, holding it steady while he managed a few sips. "The doctor said you were really hurt," Sophie said with the directness of childhood, "but Daddy said you're too stubborn to die." "Are you stubborn, Mr. Frank?" Frank managed a weak smile. "Your daddy's a smart man. How long have I been here?" 3 days. Daddy and I have been taking turns sitting with you so you wouldn't be alone. The nurses said that was very important for getting better." Through the window, Frank could see an unusual sight in the hospital parking lot. Dozens of motorcycles formed precise rows, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Men in leather jackets moved among them, with the purposeful calm of soldiers maintaining equipment. "Sophie, where's your father?" "Talking to Steele about the blood drive. They organized it for you because you needed lots of blood, and they wanted to make sure the hospital had enough for other people too." Frank's confusion must have shown on his face, because Sophie continued explaining with the patient tone of someone who'd been answering adults' questions for days. "After you got hurt saving me, all the motorcycle people came to help. They've been here every day, making sure you have everything you need, and helping the hospital take care of other patients too." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Steele Rodriguez entered, his imposing presence somehow managing to seem gentle in the hospital setting. Behind him came Razor, whose arm was still in a sling from his own gunshot wound. "Frank," Steele said, approaching the bed carefully, "I'm Steele Rodriguez, president of the local Hells Angels chapter. This is Razor, Sophie's father." Frank nodded weakly. "I know Razor. We have coffee together sometimes." "What you did?" Razor's voice caught as he looked at his daughter, alive and unharmed because of Frank's sacrifice. "I don't have words for what that means to me, to my family." "You would have done the same," Frank replied. "Maybe, but you didn't." "Maybe, you did." Without hesitation, without thinking about the cost. Steele moved closer to the bed. Frank, in our world, actions like yours create debts that can't be repaid, only honored. You've become family to us, whether you want it or not. I don't understand. Your hospital bills are covered. Every penny, now and for any ongoing care you need. Your trailer's been repaired and winterized. New roof, new furnace, full kitchen renovation. Your medical insurance premiums are handled for life. Frank tried to process the magnitude of what Steele was describing. I can't accept all that. It's not charity, Razor said firmly. It's brotherhood. You protected my daughter like she was your own. That makes you one of us. Sophie climbed carefully onto the edge of Frank's bed, mindful of his injuries. Mr. Frank, I drew you pictures of all the nice things the motorcycle people have been doing. Want to see? Frank accepted the stack of crayon drawings, each one depicting scenes Sophie had witnessed over the past 3 days. Bikers helping nurses carry supplies. Men in leather jackets reading to children in the pediatric ward. Motorcycles formed in honor guard formation outside the hospital. The whole town's been talking, Steele explained. People are seeing us differently now, seeing what we really stand for when someone we consider family needs help. Doctor. Martinez appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Mr. Miller, how are you feeling? Like I got shot, Frank replied, earning a small giggle from Sophie. Your recovery is progressing better than we hoped. The physical therapy team wants to start working with you tomorrow, and if all goes well, you could be home by the end of the week. Home to a place that's actually fit for living, Razor added. Wait until you see what Tank did with your kitchen. Frank's return home was unlike anything Clearwater had ever witnessed. A convoy of 40 motorcycles escorted the hospital transport van through town, drawing crowds of curious neighbors who'd spent weeks hearing stories about the veteran who'd taken a bullet for a biker's daughter. The trailer on Elm Street bore no resemblance to the rundown structure Frank had left 3 weeks earlier. A new roof gleamed silver in the afternoon sun, while fresh siding transformed the exterior from shabby to respectable. The small porch had been expanded and reinforced, complete with a ramp for the wheelchair he'd need during recovery. This can't be right, Frank said as Razor helped him from the van. This isn't my place. Ugil, same address, Tank Wilson replied, his massive frame dwarfing the others as he approached. Just looks a little different now. The interior transformation was even more dramatic. What had been a cramped, barely functional living space now featured an open floor plan, modern appliances, and accessibility modifications that would allow Frank to maintain independence despite his injuries. Sophie ran ahead into the kitchen, eager to show off the new features. Look, Mr. Frank, the refrigerator has an ice maker, and the stove is the kind that doesn't need matches, and Tank put in cabinets you can reach from your wheelchair. Frank stood in his own doorway, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what these men had accomplished while he'd been unconscious. How did you do all this so fast? Called in favors, Steele explained. Turns out we know a lot of people in construction, electrical work, plumbing. Amazing what you can accomplish when everyone's motivated by the same cause. The living room featured a hospital bed positioned near the window where Frank could watch the street activities he'd grown to enjoy. But more importantly, it featured something he'd never had in his solitary existence: family photos. Pictures of Sophie's visits to the hospital, images of the blood drive organized in his honor, photos of Hell's Angels members working on his house renovation. We figured you might want some memories of the good things, Razor said quietly. Frank picked up one photo, showing Sophie fast asleep in the hospital chair beside his bed, her small hand resting protectively on his arm. She stayed with me every day, said heroes shouldn't have to be alone when they're healing. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Detective Sarah Chen entered, her expression mixing official duty with personal gratitude. Frank, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We arrested Marco and his associates. They're facing charges for attempted murder, kidnapping conspiracy, and aggravated assault. The DA's confident they'll be going away for a very long time. What about the debt they mentioned? The reason they came after Razor? Detective Chen glanced at Steele, who nodded permission to continue. Turns out there was no legitimate debt. Marco's crew was running an extortion racket, targeting motorcycle clubs across 3 states. Your actions led us to evidence that's going to put a major criminal organization out of business. Frank settled into his new wheelchair, still processing the implications. So Sophie was never really in danger beyond that moment? She was in mortal danger the second those men walked into the diner, Steele corrected. But only because you were there to protect her without your intervention. The sentence didn't need completion. Everyone in the room understood how differently that morning could have ended. Sophie approached Frank's wheelchair with another drawing. "This one's my favorite," she announced, showing him a picture of a man in flannel carrying a small girl to safety. "It's called My Hero, Mr. Frank." Frank studied the crayon artwork, noting how carefully Sophie had drawn every detail she remembered. "Sophie, I'm not really a hero. I just did what anyone should do." "That's exactly what makes you a hero," Sophie replied with 6-year-old logic. "Heroes don't think they're heroes. They just help people who need helping." 6 months later, Frank Miller sat on his new porch watching the morning routine that had resumed at Maggie's diner across the street. The familiar sight of Sophie running to embrace her father brought the same daily smile it always had. But now it carried deeper meaning, the knowledge that their happiness had been preserved through shared sacrifice and unexpected brotherhood. "Morning, Frank," Sophie called as she spotted him on the porch. She broke from her usual routine to run across the street, her backpack bouncing as she navigated traffic with the fearless confidence of childhood. "Morning, Princess. How's school going?" "Good. I'm reading chapter books now, and Mrs. Patterson says my writing is really improving. Want to see my latest story?" Frank accepted the notebook Sophie pulled from her backpack. The story, written in careful second-grade handwriting, was titled How My Friend Frank Became a Hero. It detailed their first meeting at the diner, the scary day when bad men came, and Frank's decision to protect her. "The best part," Sophie read aloud, "is that Mr. Frank didn't just save me that day. He saved my whole family, because now we have lots more family than we had before." It was true. The events of that morning had created bonds that extended far beyond Frank and the Hells Angels. Maggie's diner had become an informal community center where bikers, veterans, families, and longtime residents gathered for coffee and conversation. The artificial barriers that had once divided Clearwater's social groups had dissolved in the face of shared humanity. "Daddy says you're coming to the barbecue tomorrow," Sophie continued. "Are you excited?" Frank smiled, thinking about the monthly gatherings Steele organized at the clubhouse. What had begun as a way to include Frank in the club's extended family had evolved into community-wide events that brought together people who'd never socialized before. "Wouldn't miss it. Tank promised to show me how to smoke a proper brisket. And I'm going to sing the song I learned about friendship." Razor appeared across the street, checking his watch and motioning for Sophie to hurry. "Princess, you're going to miss the bus." "Coming, Daddy." Sophie hugged Frank carefully, mindful of his still-healing injuries. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Frank." Frank watched her run back to her father, their morning embrace as warm and natural as it had always been. But now he was part of that circle of love, part of the family that gathered each morning in a small diner where strangers had once become heroes. His phone buzzed with a text from Steele. "Brother, you ready for tomorrow's surprise?" Frank replied, "With this family, I'm ready for anything." The surprise he'd learned was a small ceremony where the Hells Angels would formally present him with an honorary membership patch, not as a motorcycle club member, but as a man who'd proven himself worthy of their highest honor, protection of the innocent. As Frank watched Razor walk Sophie to the bus stop, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a forgotten veteran surviving on coffee and memories. Today, he was a beloved member of an extended family that included some of the most loyal people he'd ever known. The morning sun climbed higher over Clearwater, illuminating a town where prejudice had given way to understanding, where a moment of courage had created lasting bonds, and where a lonely old man had discovered that family was something you could choose, as well as something you could be born into. Frank Miller, hero to a 6-year-old girl and honorary brother to the Hells Angels, smiled as he watched his town wake up to another day of the unexpected fellowship that had grown from one man's decision to protect a child at any cost. Sometimes the best families were the ones that found you when you needed them most.